Good evening.
Good evening.
How are the roads? Not too bad? Minnesota. Thank you all for coming. And welcome to the penultimate lecture. I wanted to use that word. Welcome to the penultimate lecture in the University of Minnesota Center for Jewish Studies 2025-26 Community Lecture Series. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Natan Paradise, and I'm the director of the Center for Jewish Studies at the University of Minnesota. And on behalf of the Minnesota JCC, I also want to welcome you to the Minnesota JCC SABE Center. We appreciate the opportunity to partner once again with the JCC as our host for the lecture series this year. The JCC hopes that you will discover a broad range of rich programming at the Minnesota JCC, both here at the SABE Center as well as at the CAP Center across the river. I want to thank the staff here at the Minnesota JCC, and especially Katie Klein, Irit Vinitsky, and Andrea Golden, and of course Jenny up in the sound booth. Thank you, Jenny, for their support in planning for and conducting this event, as well as our community co-sponsors, Adat Yeshurun Congregation, Beth Shalom Congregation, Beth El Synagogue, Beth Jacob Congregation, Congregation Darchei Noam, the Encountering Judaism Initiative at the University of St. Thomas, Mayim Rabim Congregation, Mount Zion Temple, Or Emet, Shir Tikva, Temple of Aaron, and Temple Israel. We are also grateful to our university co-sponsors of this lecture, the Center for Holocaust and Genocide Studies, the Department of History, the Department of Spanish and Portuguese Studies, the Institute of Linguistics, and the Institute for Global Studies, as well as the J. Phillips Center for Interreligious Studies at the University of St. Thomas. And finally, I again give thanks to and for our outreach coordinator, Mariel Coulter, who continues to keep us going. This lecture is conducted in full acknowledgement that we stand on Minnesota Makoche, the homelands of the Dakota Oyate, within an area that is also the home of the Ojibwe and Ho-Chunk peoples. And this acknowledgement is made in the awareness that while sitting on this land, learning about the ways in which language served as a source of Sephardic resilience and adaptation after the expulsion of Jews from the Iberian Peninsula, it is appropriate to both acknowledge and commit to learning about the past and ongoing experiences of the indigenous peoples of America and about their sources of resilience and adaptation after their own expulsions, including the revitalization of their languages. For resources and suggestions about what each of us can do in response to our implicated relationship with the indigenous communities whose land we inhabit, I recommend you visit the website of the Native Governance Center, a Native-led nonprofit dedicated to assisting Native nations in strengthening their governance systems and capacity to exercise sovereignty. You'll find them at nativegov.org. It is in this spirit that we acknowledge that we stand on Minnesota Makoche, the homelands of the Dakota Oyate. The Center for Jewish Studies was established 24 years ago actually, and quickly followed that up with the establishment of the Community Lecture Series in order to bring to campus and to the local community some of the most exciting researchers from the full range of scholarship in the field of Jewish studies, with the goal of fulfilling the educational mission of the Center for Jewish Studies as broadly as possible. I want to again welcome back our regulars in the audience and to invite the rest of you to also become regulars. To those of you who are watching the recording on our YouTube channel at some future date, we appreciate your interest and desire to learn as well. When it comes to regular attendees, none have been so faithful as Bob and Debbie Wolk. And so it is with considerable sadness that I share that Debbie Wolk passed away on February 26th. Debbie loved learning, and we loved seeing that in her at our lectures. The remainder of our lecture series this year, tonight and our last lecture in mid-April, is dedicated to Debbie's memory. Zichrona Livracha. Our series this year is sponsored by the Marvin and Betty Borman Foundation. We are incredibly grateful for their support. If you too would like to support the Center's activities, ensuring the growth and continued vitality of the Center for Jewish Studies, you may contact me or speak with me after the lecture. And if you're shy, you can also just visit our website to make a donation. This lecture series is part of the Center's investment in the community. and we invite you to invest in us as well. And now it is my great pleasure to introduce you to our lecturer for this evening, Devin Naar, who will be teaching us about a Jewish language for all occasions, Ladino culture and its innovations. Devin Naar is the Isaac Al-Hadaf Professor in Sephardic Studies and an Associate Professor of History and Jewish Studies at the University of Washington in Seattle, where he also serves as chair of the Sephardic Studies program. He received his PhD in history at Stanford University. He has also served as a Fulbright Fellow in Greece. In his leadership role in the Sephardic Studies program, Dr. Naar has spearheaded a project to collect, preserve, and disseminate the rich Sephardic and Ladino historical, literary, and cultural heritage, creating the first major online Sephardic Studies digital library and archive comprised of more than 1,500 artifacts, books, and letters collected from residents of the Seattle area and across the country. His first book, Jewish Salonika, Between the Ottoman Empire and Modern Greece, published by Stanford University Press in 2016, won the 2016 National Jewish Book Award in the category of research based on archival material, and was named a finalist in Sephardic culture. It also won the 2017 Edmund Keeley Prize for Best Book in Modern Greek Studies, awarded by the Modern Greek Studies Association. His current book project explores the dispersal of Sephardic Jews from the dissolving Ottoman Empire during the early 20th century and the creation of new Sephardic communal hubs in Europe and the Americas, including Seattle. Dr. Naar teaches a very wide range of courses linked to his areas of research, including courses in modern Jewish history, Jewish culture from antiquity until today, Sephardic history and culture, the history and memory of the Holocaust, relations between Jews, Christians, and Muslims in lands of the former Ottoman Empire, and migrations from the Mediterranean world to the Americas in the 20th century. Please join me in welcoming Devin Naar.
Buenas tardes, ¿qué haber? Okay. I think the whole lecture was supposed to be in Ladino. Is that right, Natan? It's a pleasure for me to be here in the Twin Cities and in Minneapolis, and I'd like to express my gratitude to Natan, to Marielle, and also to Jenny up there, who's going to be helping with the slides, and it's very nice to see you here today. I want to start with a joke about Esperanto, which I mentioned here. What language do you speak at an Esperanto meeting? Yiddish. Because the founders of Esperanto, the folks that were trying to create a language that transcended national boundaries and would be universal and sort of perhaps get Jews out of the pigeonhole of being on the outside, that was many of the founders of that language were Yiddish speakers. But there was sort of an organic corollary to Esperanto that operated in the Mediterranean world for nearly half a millennium. And that is a language that is known by a number of names we're going to talk about, but typically in the United States we call it Ladino. And the center where Ladino was spoken by the most people is a city that is today in Greece, but was once part of the Ottoman Empire, and that city is known as Salonika or Thessaloniki. And you can see here from about 110 years ago, a Salonican Jewish author writing in French about his coveted city. That's how Salonika was understood at the time, because it was coveted by all the different peoples that resided in it. He described Ladino, which operates in the city of Salonika as a kind of Esperanto, that the Greek, the Turk, the Albanian, the Bulgarian, the stranger jabber, the Turkish train conductor, the waiter at the Greek cafe, the Roma bootblack, all call to you in the language of Cervantes. And what this quote also does, it encapsulates one of the popular, perhaps we could say, mythologies about Ladino or Judeo-Spanish. The sense that it was sort of the language of Cervantes that had been preserved and frozen in time since the Jews were expelled from Spain in 1492 until our days today. Now, there is a kernel to that insofar as many of the aspects that undergird the Ladino language do trace their origins to medieval or perhaps early modern Spanish. There are elements of Cervantes' Castilian that you will be able to hear and see in Judeo-Spanish or Ladino. But as we'll also see, and as Natan alluded to, the language and the culture has been very resilient and has transformed tremendously over the generations. One of the myths about Ladino is that it is a language that was frozen in time. It is not, as I'd like to show you. It was a language that was in use for all occasions. It was a language of the home. It was the language of the synagogue. It was the language of the marketplace. It was also the language not only of folk tales and of romances, of songs, and the language of jokes, and a language of curse words, a language of the kitchen, but it was also a language became the language of religious practice, a language of theater, a language of journalism, a language of literature, a language of politics. So this is why I say it was a language for all occasions. Today, to the extent that we think about Ladino, which is probably, other than me, probably not, well, maybe a couple of my colleagues who I've met today are occasionally thinking about Ladino, but to the extent that we think about Ladino popularly in the United States, and more broadly, oftentimes the language and the culture are confined to a variety of very particular domains. Food, music, maybe liturgy. But what I'd like to show you today is that the language operated in many, many more domains as well. And I'd like to explore some of that richness and some of the innovations that came with adapting the language to new spaces, to new context, to new genres of cultural expression. We get the next slide, please. Here's a little basic map for you to orient ourselves. We go back to Spain, 1492. Columbus sailed the ocean blue. The Jews and Muslims were expelled from Spain or subjugated that same year. And the conquest of the indigenous peoples of the Americas, to which Natan also alluded, also began that same year. When Jews left Spain, those who left wound up largely traversing the Mediterranean. Some hopped over to North Africa, others to Italy. Others eventually wound up in Northern Europe, largely as conversos, who became Jews some generations later. But the largest percentage of those who left Spain wound up traversing the Mediterranean and settling in the lands of what was then the vast Ottoman Empire. And you can see that land in the yellow over here. It was, the Ottoman Empire is one of the longest enduring empires in the history of the world. It lasted from 1299 until 1923. The United States were 250 years we're about to celebrate. So here we have 623-year-long empire. So, and you can also see the geographic vastness of this empire. From parts all the way up to Central Europe, the Ottomans invaded Vienna 2 times, to parts of North Africa, the Balkans, Greece, Turkey, and parts of the Middle East, including the land of Israel. And it is in those geographies, and especially the geographies of the Balkans, Greece, Turkey, and we're going to talk a little bit about the land of Israel, where the descendants of those Iberian Jews wound up settling and where they developed this language that we are going to call Ladino. Next slide, please. What's fascinating about the language, and there's this song that is attributed, it's very understood to be a very old song. It's called Tierras Ajenas, or Árboles lloran por lluvias. And what's fascinating about this song is that its meaning among the speakers and the singers of the song has likely changed over the generations. So if we could play a little excerpt of this song, and you can listen to the Ladino, which will sound like Spanish. You can follow the English.
Querida amante, Señora.
stop the song. Thank you. So if you understand Spanish, does anybody here understand Spanish a little bit?
Also
Okay.
French.
Or French, yeah, a Romance language. If you understand a Romance language, you may understand this. What's fascinating also about this song is the meaning. So on the one hand, there are several different ways to interpret this song. On the one hand, it's like a love song. Someone goes far away, and maybe they go to war, they go on a voyage, they're afraid that they will not return. They will never be able to see their loved ones again, they will die in a foreign land. Another meaning of the song relates to the expulsion from Spain. Jews expelled from Spain, and this idea that they will be dying in foreign lands, that they have this sense of connection to Spain, which is the land, their land. But what's fascinating is that in the context of the Second World War, when Jews were being deported from their homes in the Balkans, largely to Auschwitz, they changed the words of the song. Instead of saying, or in addition to saying, en tierras ajenas yo me voy morir, they said, en las tierras de Polonia, in the lands of Poland, certainly I will die. What's fascinating there is that the patria, the homeland, if you will, is not Sepharad, is not Spain in that latest rendition, but it becomes places like Salonika, or Rhodes, or Sarajevo, or Castoria. All these towns where the descendants of those Jews exiled from Spain had settled and lived and thrived for a half a millennium. Next slide, please. How do we come to Ladino, and how do I come to Ladino? Or this thing that we're calling Ladino. And for me, there's a family story here. Here you can see my family about over 100 years ago. This is their passport photo. In the center is my great-grandfather, who was a rabbi, which is the title in Ladino is the Hebrew word chacham, the rabbi, and my great-grandmother there. And the little boy there is my grandfather, whom I called nono, which is a Ladino word for grandfather. It's also an Italian word for grandfather. So what's fascinating about this language, I heard this language all the time when I was growing up from my nono and from his brothers and sisters. Nobody ever spoke to me in the language, but I developed a basic vocabulary of greeting words, to say hello and be nice, food words so I could eat something, and also curse words so I could defend myself. And a little bit of liturgy. After that, I could say nothing at all. In the house, they called it Spanish. This is what it was. But as I entered the world, I discovered this is not like Spanish like everybody else's Spanish, even though there are many different kinds of Spanish out there. So it's a little bit of a different kind of Spanish. And it goes by different names. In the Ottoman Empire, it was actually identified as the Jewish language. It was called Judezmo, which means something like Judaism. Say, hablas Judezmo, do you speak Jewish? Which makes a lot of sense. Or hablas Judeo, do you speak Jewish? Which is what you are saying when you ask if somebody speaks Yiddish, because in Yiddish means Jewish. Say, do you speak Yiddish? You're saying, do you speak Jewish? Well, what the Jewish language was varied from place to place. And in the Ottoman Empire, speaking Jewish meant speaking this Spanish-based language, which is really, really a fascinating phenomenon, such that when some Spanish sailors came to the ports of the Ottoman Empire in the 17th, 18th, 19th century, and they're speaking this language that sounded like Ladino, it was Castilian, the locals thought they were Jewish. When Argentine cinema came to the Balkans, the Jews flocked to the theater to see the Jewish movies because Jewish was Spanish. And when Ladino speakers came to New York City in the beginning of the 20th century and they went to places like Harlem, they encountered Puerto Ricans, who they also assumed were Jewish because, once again, Jewish was Spanish and Spanish was Jewish. That was the environment in which they lived. It only came to be called something other than Jewish in a broader context. In the broader Jewish context, once it became clear, a number of things became clear, that the name Jewish was already taken. It was taken either by Yiddish on the one hand or by Hebrew on the other hand. These were the more dominant Jewish languages. And from the perspective of scientists and linguists of the 19th century, touring and visiting the Middle Eastern world and encountering Jews speaking this language, they gave it a more technical kind of term, Judeo-Spanish, like a Jewish Spanish language. Sometimes Yiddish has been called Judeo-German, Judeo-Spanish. But the thing is that Judeo-Spanish only identifies two of the key elements of the language, and as we'll see, there are many other linguistic elements that have shaped the language over the generations as Jews were in contact with the cultures of their neighbors in the places in which they resided over the generations. In Israel, for example, sometimes it's called Spaniolit, which again evokes the Spanish identity. And Ladino is a term that we use often now in the United States, perhaps the best known of these terms, but it is a contested term. Ladino is related to the word Latin. So the idea was, in contradistinction to Halashon HaKodesh, the Holy Tongue, Hebrew, Jews were speaking this Latin-based, this Romance language, which would take the name Ladino. And the term Ladino was originally used to describe those texts that were translated really word for word from Hebrew into this Romance language. So we'll be speaking about it in a moment. The Haggadah. The Haggadah preserves Hebrew syntax, but is in the Romance language. So that's the strict meaning of Ladino. Now we use it to refer to the spoken language, the literary language, all the different variations of the language. Next slide, please. How did I become acquainted with the language in its written form? Was I began to ask in college to learn a little bit more about what happened to my family. My grandfather, my nono's brother, had been in the United States. He returned to Salonika after World War I, thinking that the end of the war would have brought new opportunities. And when things got a little bit dicey in the 30s, they began applying for visas to come to the United States. Couldn't get one because of the quotas, immigration restriction that had been enacted in the United States in 1924. And so this is my Tio Salomon and my Tio Esther. They and their two children wound up being deported during the Nazi occupation of Greece and were murdered. But I didn't know a whole lot about the details of their story, and I started to ask. I asked Nono, I asked my tios and tias, you don't have any documentation? And one day, one of my great uncles pulls out a document that looks like this. And he says, this will tell you something, if you could advance. The only thing I could read here, it said Thessaloniki, which is the Greek name for Salonika, and the date, sometime in 1945. So I figured, well, maybe if I could figure out what this letter said, it will tell me something about, more specifically about what happened to Tio Salomon and Tia Esther and their family. And I asked one of my other uncles, I said, well, what language is this? And he said, this is Spanish. I said, you gotta be kidding me. What do you mean this is Spanish? It's got all these squiggly marks here. What's going on? He said, what is this? He said, well, this is how we used to write Spanish. What do you mean you used to write Spanish like this? How we wrote Spanish in Hebrew letters. And I had gone to Hebrew school. I knew what Hebrew letters. It's not Hebrew letters. No, this is our Hebrew letters. Go to the next slide. So anybody here know the Hebrew alphabet? A couple of people? Okay. Hebrew used in Ladino as like in modern Hebrew, and the Yiddish, all Jewish languages written in the Hebrew script, goes from right to left. So if we start on the right, what's the first letter on the right? Somebody want to call it out? Lamed, Chet. Anybody else? It's Aleph. Anybody know Arabic? The Arabic Alif. This looks a lot more like the Arabic Alif. So it already takes the form of the letter, takes some influence from its surrounding environment. Next letter, anybody know what that one is? Shin. Nope, that's a Lamed. Oh wait, don't give it away yet. Don't go to the next one. How about the next one, third letter? Mem. Okay, so you got Mem. Great. So 1 for 3. For baseball, that's good. For an academic class, 1 out of 3 is very bad. Next one, you got the fourth one there, right?
Must be an Aleph.
Aleph again, right? Then? Nun. Very good. Then? Very good. Then? Who said Samach? Bravo, Samach. That's exactly right. So this was the first word I was able to decode, trying to figure it out. Next. It's Almanes, which means Germans. So Germans. So in fact, what the letter did was it detailed a little bit about what happened to my family during the war. Go advance 2 slides, please. We don't have time for that. Next one. Okay. So I'm going to explain to you a little bit about how the language works. Because, as I mentioned, it is based on Spanish Castilian, but it has introduced over the centuries linguistic and cultural elements that have been absorbed from the surrounding cultures and societies with whom the Sephardic Jews came into contact in the Balkans and the Mediterranean world. So there is an influence not only of Castilian, but also Portuguese, and also other Iberian dialects or languages, Hebrew elements, and the Hebrew alphabet being a key historical component to the language, but also influences from Arabic and Turkish and Greek and Italian and French, and in some regions Bulgarian. So you can see the wide-ranging influences that have shaped the language. So I want to give you a little bit about how the language works by reference to a few refranes or proverbs or sayings, which I have rendered for you in Latin letters so you don't have to bust your eyes trying to decode it in Hebrew script. Okay, let's go to the next one. Now, if you know Spanish, this one will probably make a lot of sense to you. Cuando se escurece es para amanecer. And we have an expression like this in English. When it is dark out, dawn is coming. So it's like, don't worry. Light at the head of the tunnel. This kind of thing. So this is an expression that captures really the Spanish-based influences and basis of the language. Next one, please. Now we have one that involves a little bit more extra elements. Okay? Se levantan los pepinos y ajarvan los pachavanes. So if you know Spanish, you could probably help me with the beginning. Se levantan los pepinos. Now you got to think like figuratively because it doesn't actually make sense. But it means pepinos are cucumbers. So the cucumbers rise up, which I'm sure happens all the time in your kitchen. Y ajarvan los bakshavanes. Now, ajarvar is a Hebrew-based word that they turned into a Spanish verb, like cherev. Lo yesagoy el goy cherev, lo yimaldu od milchama. Cherev means, in Hebrew, it means to fight or to go to war, but in Ladino it means to hit or to beat. Okay? Los bakshavanes, bakshavan is the Turkish word for farmer. Okay? So we have the cucumbers rose up and they beat the farmers. You still don't know what it means though, right? Because this is an idiom. What does it mean? Anybody have a guess? When would you use the expression? The cucumbers have risen up and they are beating the farmers.
An uprising.
Yeah, an uprising. Who's uprising though? The little, and who are the little people probably in your life? Your children. When your children talk back to you, or when your students tell you that they know what's right and you don't know anything. It's like the cucumbers are rising up and beating the farmers. Okay? Next one. Here's a good one too. Son gente de Piron. Gente is Italian. Piron is from Greek piruni. It means fork. So the people of the fork. Who are the people of the fork? In a world when most people have their hands and their spoons, who are the people of the fork?
The wealthy.
The wealthy. So this is a short way to refer to wealthy people. They're the people of the fork. Next one. Arova pitas beza mezuzah. So pitas is Arabic, like pita bread. Okay? Mezuzah, you know mezuzah. It's the Hebrew, the thing you put by the door with the prayer, the protective blessing there. So someone who steals pita bread and kisses a mezuzah is what? Hypocrite. Correct. They didn't have the word hypocrite, but they had this expression. Someone who steals pita and kisses the mezuzah. That's a very nice way to say hypocrite. We have plenty of those in our world today, as has been always the case. One more. This one's a little fresh, so I hope you'll excuse me. Afilu el chacham se levanta debajo su jubeh. Afilu is Hebrew, afilu pa'am echad, even, el chacham, the smart one. In this case, it means specifically rabbi. It was the title for a rabbi. Se levanta, we have that from before, a levantar, to rise up. Debajo su jubeh. Jubeh is Turkish for robe. Do I need to explain this? So even the rabbi gets it up underneath his robe. I said it's a little fresh. You get all the dimensions here, all occasions. What does it mean? Rabbis are people too. There's no infallibility of the Pope here. Rabbis are people too. So you get a sense of some of the color of the language, also how the expressions are formed, bringing together these different linguistic elements, and how idioms are in that way formed. Most of these are specifically Ladino idioms. I mean, you cannot say these in any other language because they don't have the same linguistic shape to them. Next slide, please. But Ladino, as I mentioned, was not just the language of conversation in the kitchen or proverbs or sayings or anything like that. What I'd like to focus on now is looking at the way in which Ladino functioned in a variety of cultural and political spaces. One of the most important Ladino texts published after the expulsion from Spain is this series of texts known as Me'am Lo'ez. And it has a Hebrew title. What does Me'am Lo'ez mean? It means from a foreign tongue, or a foreign nation, a foreign people. The author of this textbook, who is of this commentary, Yaakov Huli, he was from Jerusalem, Ottoman Jerusalem. He was worried that the members of his community and communities across the Ottoman Empire were no longer having direct access to the Hebrew texts. They were not able to necessarily, not everybody was able to sit down and read a page of Talmud. They couldn't read the Shulchan Aruch, the code of law, on their own. So rather than imagine a scenario in which everything will change and the men will go and they'll all learn how to read Hebrew and Aramaic and they'll be proficient in everything, he said, you know what? I'm going to have to bring Jewish knowledge, Jewish traditions, Jewish practices to the people in the language they already speak, the language that they know, Judeo-Spanish or Ladino. And he does it begrudgingly. He says, this is not our language originally, this is the language we picked up along the way, in galut, in exile, in diaspora, this Romance language. And so that's why he calls it from a foreign tongue, or from a foreign language, but in the process of creating this text, he does something fascinating, which he transforms this Romance-based language with all this mix that we've been looking at into a Jewish language and a Jewish literary language, a language of Jewish religious commentary and study. So what this series of books are, which were, obviously the one guy didn't write all these volumes from 1730 to 1899, but it was a series of rabbis who lived over the course of nearly 2 centuries all across the Ottoman Empire, each writing a commentary on one of the 24 books of the Tanakh, okay? And bringing to the reader all of the basic elements of Jewish practice, observance, some midrash, some tales, and everything like that. This is actually the copy from my great-grandfather's library. He was that rabbi you saw in the beginning. This is from Salonika in 1826, and it's the commentary on Numbers, okay? Yeah, on Numbers, yeah. And you can see there, so you see again the Hebrew letters, a little bit of Hebrew language in there, but a lot of the description there is in the Ladino language in Hebrew script. So next slide, please. But as we move into modern times, we encounter a variety of other texts too. One of the texts that is classically chanted still to today in some families in Ladino is the Haggadah of Pesach. And we have Pesach coming up in just a few weeks. And here you can see a little excerpt on the right-hand side of what one of these Haggadot looked like. And this one was published in Livorno in Italy. Italy was sort of this crossroads between different Jewish cultures. And in the beginning of the 20th century, there were important publishing houses there that would serve the Ladino-speaking Sephardic communities of the broader Mediterranean world. And I can't, it's hard for me to see what it says here. Tomara la masa de abajo y la envolverá en la lechuga y enteñará en el jaroset y dirá zechar lemikdash. So it says, what does it say? It says, take a pizza matzah and wrap it in lettuce and then put it in the haroset as a memory of the temple, of the Beit HaMikdash, okay? So this is something that you do on Pesach. It was done all in Ladino, in the vernacular, okay? So there you have it. But Ladino also then became a language of ethical texts, of Musar. And eventually in the 19th and 20th centuries, all genres of literary production were operative essentially in Ladino, from theater to journalism to novels and more. Next slide, please. Here we can see an example, early 20th century, of reading the newspaper in the Ottoman Empire, in Ottoman Salonika. And you can see these guys, they are a la turca. I mean, they're dressed in the Ottoman style with the fez, which was the symbol of the male citizen of the Ottoman Empire. And you can see here, this photograph represented the bane of the existence of the Ladino newspaper editor. Why? Because there are like 20 guys reading one newspaper. And you see many articles in the Ladino press saying, if not every one of you who's reading the newspaper, if you don't buy your own copy, there will be no more newspaper for you to consume, because I can't manage with one person buying a copy, reading it out loud for 20 people, and then giving it to their buddy who's going to read it for another 20 people. And now there are 300 people that have benefited from only one copy of the newspaper. All 300 of you should be buying the newspaper. But it gives you a sense also, you have the development of a public sphere here, the public tribune, reciting the news in the public space. Next slide, please. And the newspapers became a very, very important piece of the development of a sense of communal consciousness, political consciousness, social consciousness, civic consciousness of the literate classes. So Jewish societies tended to be a little bit more literate than their neighbors in many places, and that was the case for Jews in the Ottoman Empire as well. Primarily, men would be more likely to be literate, but also women increasingly in the 19th and 20th centuries who would begin going to school. And here you can see a range of some of those newspapers from different parts of the Ottoman Empire. Here are a few from Salonika, which was the largest of the communities. About 90,000 Ladino-speaking Jews in Salonika at the turn of the 20th century, in a city of 170,000 people. So over half the population were Ladino-speaking Jews, but also the imperial capital of Istanbul. They were reading El Tiempo, which was a major daily newspaper. In Izmir, there was La Buena Esperanza, and El Tiempo, it's like the Times, basically. La Época is also the epic. It's the epoch. It's like also another way to say it, like the Times. Good Hope in Izmir, and Avanti in Salonika. Avanti in Salonika is very interesting. That was a very, very popular newspaper. It was a socialist newspaper that catered to the working classes. Avanti means forward, okay, onward. Okay, so you can see also the top here in El Tiempo, the Arabic language Ottoman Turkish also. So you can see the multiculturality of the environment. Next slide, please. They also read almost anything that Europeans were reading. Eventually you could read in Ladino. You could read Marx in Ladino, you could read Herzl in Ladino. You could read Shakespeare in Ladino. You could read Dumas and Molière in Ladino. So all sorts of classic European texts were made accessible in Ladino, more like adaptations, shall we say, that tried to cater, and this is another one of the innovations, make them make sense to the local readers. So here's Swift's Gulliver's Travels. I don't know if you remember Gulliver's Travels, but there's a scene where it involves some drinking, okay? And in the scene, it's beer. Beer, don't drink beer so much in the Ottoman Empire. That would be an import. But what they do drink is raki, which is arak, or ouzo, which is an anise-based aperitif. So to make it make sense for the readers, here's a scene where they are drinking raki. La fatiga, la calor y una buena cantidad de raki que yo había bebido antes de salir de la nave me roncharon al sueño y yo me expandí sobre la hierba y dormí mientras 9 horas. Okay, this is when Gulliver gets off the ship. Okay, he was drinking on the ship, and in the Ladino version, he's drinking raki, because what else would you be drinking? It was not possible to imagine drinking anything other than raki. Next slide, please. And there were also original Ladino productions as well that emerged in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. And here you can see, if I asked you, who's your favorite Yiddish writer? Maybe somebody could name a Yiddish novelist or a writer of fiction. Anybody? Shlomo Aleichem. Okay, Singer Brothers. In other words, you could name a few. Can you name your favorite Ladino novelist? Probably not. Nobody can. You know how many Ladino novels have been translated into English? Not many. None. One in a very obscure press in the UK that you cannot get. It's out of print. I'm working on a translation with some colleagues of 3 Ladino novels from the Ottoman Empire, but it offers a fascinating world. One of the most prolific of these novelists was a guy by the name of Elia Carmona from Istanbul. He wrote 40 novels. 40 novels. Very inaccessible. Nobody knows about them. And I used to talk about Elia Carmona, and I used to say that Elia Carmona doesn't even exist on Wikipedia, and it's like, if you don't exist in Wikipedia, like you're not a real thing. Since that time, I think somebody in one of my lectures made a Wikipedia entry for Elia Carmona. But now you go, he exists on Wikipedia, so he's real. I'm not making him up. Here's one of his, here's his memoir, his autobiography. And he describes in his autobiography about why did he start writing novels in Ladino. And here he says, having noticed that those who read in Spanish, and again he uses the term español, meaning Spanish, which he's writing this in Hebrew letters again, but he's just calling it Spanish, are those who know neither Turkish, which was the language of the state, or French, which was the language of European civilization, and also became a language that many of the Sephardic Jews of the Ottoman Empire and Middle East learned going to French Jewish schools run by the Alliance Israélite Universelle, which was based in Paris. So if you don't know those two languages, he targeted his writing at them. I began to write in the popular language which was understood, check this out, even by a child and old women. So in other words, this was a revolutionary act in terms of a little pejorative, but nonetheless wanting to make his text accessible across the generations and across gender identities for men and women, for children and elderly alike, who would take these stories, these novels, some of which were serialized in the newspapers, others published as discrete volumes, and they'd read for entertainment, for education, to pass the time. Next slide. Ladino also was not a language that was exclusive to the Jewish space. And this is something I think I want to emphasize for a moment. Here you can see on the right, for example, in Salonika, a notary named Sotiros Papadimas carrying around business cards in Ladino and Hebrew letters. And it was known that in Salonika and in certain Jewish neighborhoods in Istanbul or Izmir, it was not uncommon for non-Jews to speak the Jewish language, especially if they were the demographic minority in areas where Jews predominated. On the left-hand side, we have a fascinating lottery ticket that was for the benefit of Jewish orphans in the town of Izmir, which is today in Turkey. And what's fascinating about this is it really reflects the multiculturalism or the multinationality of the Ottoman world in the 19th and 20th centuries, because you can see the Ladino in Hebrew letters is in the center, okay, in Rashi script, which was the main font that was used to publish Ladino newspapers and other things like that. And then on the right, you can see some text in Ottoman Turkish, in Arabic script, which was the language of the state, the dominant language. On the left-hand side, you can see the languages of the Christian neighbors. At the top is Greek, and at the bottom is Armenian. And then, little tiny piece, the bottom right is French, which may have been one of the languages that could bring together at least the elites of the different communities. When the Sultan visited Salonika in the late 19th century, he talked to the chief rabbi in French, if you could believe it, because that was the only language they had in common. Okay? But here you can see the expectation here is the development of a civic identity for the city. This was an effort to support Jewish orphans, but the expectation and the pitch here was that not only Jews would support a Jewish orphanage, but Armenian, Greek, and Turkish, and also maybe European merchants who were living in the area would also support for the benefit of the shared good of the city. Next slide. Here's another example of the shared element. We bring ourselves to Ottoman Jerusalem. We speak very little about this, I would suspect, but what was the main language spoken by Jews in Jerusalem and in the land of Israel from the 16th century to the 19th century? It was not Hebrew as a spoken language until really the late 19th century, revitalized. It was not Arabic. The main language, it was not Yiddish. The main language spoken by Jews in the land of Israel, from Jerusalem to Hebron to Gaza, which had, Gaza City had a Ladino-speaking chief rabbi, it was Ladino. That was the dominant Jewish language spoken in the land of Israel until the 19th century. So much so that when missionaries first arrive in Ottoman Palestine in the 19th century, and you can see this in memoirs and correspondence, one of the first things that they do is they get a hold of a Ladino tutor so that they can learn Ladino, because they understood in order for me to communicate with the Jews, I'm going to have to speak their language. And as I mentioned, the Jewish language, the dominant Jewish language of Ottoman Palestine at the time was Ladino, Judeo-Spanish. And here you can see that it extended beyond the boundaries of the Jewish community as well. I don't know if any of you are familiar with, recently passed away a few years ago, Aleph Bet Yehoshua, the well-known Israeli author. This is the memoir of his father, who was also like a historian of sorts. And he writes This is from Hebrew, which he writes. There were joint compounds of Jews and Muslims. He's talking about the old city of Jerusalem in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. We were like one family. You got to think about this in today's context too. You got to suspend your disbelief for a moment, open up a portal to a different world. We were all friends. Our mothers poured out their hearts with the Muslim women and vice versa. The Muslim women accustomed themselves to speaking the Ladino language. They frequently used that language's proverbs and idioms, perhaps some of the ones that we saw ourselves. Our children played with their Muslim children in the yard, and if children from the neighborhood hurt us, the Muslim children who lived in our compound protected us. They were our allies. This was the world of the Ottoman Empire and Ottoman Jerusalem. But imagine that, right? Muslims, what he's referring to, this is the world. The Ottoman Empire was organized according to religious community, essentially. Christian, Jews, and Muslims. The idea of nationality would be a European import of the late 19th and early 20th century. When he's speaking about Muslims, he's speaking about what we call today Palestinians, right? You understand, the Palestinians, who at home were speaking Palestinian Arabic, but the common language, and this is the really interesting, the common language in some of these communities was Ladino. Next slide. I want to now turn a little bit more to the political dimension and see how Ladino operated in the political domain. There was a major event that took place in Salonika in 1908, and that was the reintroduction of an Ottoman constitution and a parliament. That happened with the Young Turk Revolution in Salonika, this majority Jewish city. It is from that city that the slogans of liberté, fraternité, and égalité, the revolutionary slogans of democracy and citizenship, echoed out across the entire Middle East. It started right there in Salonika, in a square known afterwards as Liberty Square, which, by the way, is the same place about 35 years later where all the Jewish men were rounded up and sent to forced labor before them being deported to the concentration camps, really to Auschwitz, to the Auschwitz-Birkenau. But here you can see this moment of all these different people in the Ottoman Empire coming together under the shared flag of the Ottoman Empire, which they understood as an umbrella nation under which many different nations could seek shelter and protection. So this was an idea of an imperial citizen in which there was no expectation of assimilation. In other words, this would be displaced by the ideals of exclusivist nationalism. Greece is for the Greece. Greece is for the Greeks. Turkey is only for the Turkish-speaking Turkish Muslims. Bulgaria is for the Bulgarians, okay? And this idea of nationalism would take root. Very different vision right now, because you can see with the declaration of the Constitution, the flags here in all the languages. You can see the Hebrew characters there in the back on the left. You see what it says? Viva la libertad. Long live liberty. Okay, and then you have Armenian, you have Bulgarian, you have Ottoman Turkish and Arabic script. They even came up with the song La Marseillaise Salonicienne, the Salonican anthem, like the French Revolutionary anthem. And at the top in Ottoman Turkish it says Yaşasın millet, long live the nation. In Ottoman Turkish, the nation they understood as a nation composed of all the many different ethnic groups, and there was no conflict between being part of your specific community, speaking your language, practicing your religion, and living among your community, and then also being part of this broader Ottoman polity. That would eventually disappear. Next slide. Here's a fascinating song that suggests the ways in which these different communities could come together as Ottomans. And this is like a military march, an Ottoman military march in Ladino. So if we could play a little excerpt of this, you can follow along.
Mancebos de los casales y muchos de Salonic, mos hicimos voluntarios, mos fuimos a las guerrillas. Ya la libertad se va a hacer, ya nuestra sangre se va a verter por amor de la Turquía. Turcos, judíos y cristianos, todos otomanos, nos tomimos de las manos, jurimos de ser hermanos.
Okay, could stop that, please? Great. So you get this in. This is a really patriotic song, right? It's a patriotic song. They're willing to die for their beloved country. Their beloved country is what? It's Turkey. That was the colloquial name for the entirety of the Ottoman Empire. Jews, Christians, and Muslims. Turks they use as symbolizing the Muslim here, coming together. I mean, this is a fascinating dimension, fascinating dynamic. Next slide. That would also have profound impacts on the way in which these communities thought about the emergence of the new political movement known as Zionism, of which the Jews in the Ottoman Empire were very skeptical. Because if you think about it, they're like, well, the land of Israel is already in our country. We can go to this part of our country whenever we want. We have family there, maybe we have business ties there. It's a completely different thing. We know people there. It's part of our country. What are we going to do? We're going to overthrow our own country? This is a terrible idea. And so you can see in a primer trying to explain what Zionism is, you can see a very different attitude toward the movement among Ottoman Jews as they describe it in Ladino because of their own positionality and their own relationship with the broader dynamics that are at play in their own history. The acknowledgement that we owe to the Ottoman Empire is widespread and agreed upon by all the Ottoman Jews as a debt of the entire Jewish nation. Okay? With regard to us, the Ottoman Empire is our beloved homeland. Our life is hers. But we believe that it is our duty to think also of the fate of our unfortunate brothers who are mistreated in other countries, and our most ardent desire is to see them sheltered under the same protecting wings that sheltered us in the most critical time in our history. It's an allusion to the expulsion of the Jews from Spain in 1492. We wish that in Ottoman Palestine, our suffering co-religionists can come and live freely. This was Zionism in Ladino. It's very fascinating, right? Because it's like we're at home in this land. We don't want to overthrow the land. We don't need a separate state. Our situation is decent here, relatively speaking. Things would change. But what they're referring to is that Jews in Eastern Europe suffering from pogroms and other kinds of persecutions come here to the Ottoman Empire and join us here. You will become part of the Ottoman Jewish society and you will be protected just as our ancestors were. This is a very different model of an expectation of what the future of Jewish life with their neighbors would be in the lands of the Ottoman Empire and its successor territories, including what would become Mandate Palestine. Next slide, please. The other thing that the Ladino press says, don't go to America. Fascinating. They say, don't go to America. They say, go to America, you will lose your Judaism. This is what they understood. You go to America, you will lose your Judaism, your Jewishness will disappear. So they said, really, the only place for you to go is the Ottoman Empire. This is the argument that the Ladino press is making in the 1880s and 1890s. But by the time of a series of wars that destroy the Ottoman Empire, the Balkan Wars, followed by World War I, and then another war between Greece and Turkey, the whole universe that I was describing of all these people kind of living together and trying to make a future for themselves as neighbors is replaced through the process of unmixing the populations. And the ideas of exclusivist nationalism take hold, and the populations are divided up. So in this context, Jews begin to flee for the first time from the Ottoman Empire, coming to the United States. Whereas Jews from Eastern Europe are coming from the 1880s, Jews from the Ottoman Empire begin really in large numbers coming in the 1910s. It's like a generation or so later. One of the most fascinating booklets I came across through the process of collecting these texts in Seattle was a guide for Sephardic immigrants coming to America. And here you can see the front cover and a little excerpt of the opening essay, which you can see at the top. It says La Emigración. But what's interesting is the ad on the opening, on the inside front cover. See what it's for? You can see it in English. Phonographs. Anybody here remember a phonograph player? What is a phonograph? It's a record player, right? So what's fascinating here, though, is what does this record player, this ad offer? Cantes en todas las lenguas. Songs in all the languages. What are all the languages? Español, Spanish, by which they mean Ladino. Turco, Turkish. Grego, Greek. Arabo, Arabic, etc. Those are all the languages. But that reveals their cultural environment, okay? So you come to America, the thing that will connect you to home and cure your homesickness will be the songs of your homeland, the songs of your society, in all the languages, and I just named them for you, okay? What this essay does is very fascinating. It tells you what the immigrant should expect when they come to America. And after this, I'm going to wrap up. What do you expect when you come to America? So you're going to get on a big ship, and you're going to come across the ocean. It's going to be a very difficult voyage, and it's called El Vapor de la Salvación, the ship of salvation. And you will get off at this place called Ellis Island, which will be like a prison. And probably you may get deported. And if you are not deported, you will come to the city of New York City, and you will find buildings that are taller than buildings you have ever seen before. Some people would say in their memoirs that the buildings were taller than mosques. That was their point of reference. But in this text, he says he has a very special Ladino word that he uses to describe these very tall buildings, which are called skyscrapers. And you will see these fascinating public spaces where they're selling cold frozen treats that you are familiar with, but they put them in these triangle things. And what are those called? Ice cream cones. You get the sense. So in other words, he's trying to help the newcomers adapt to what they will expect to find in the United States. Next slide. And one of the ways that they might do that is by learning the two necessary languages for all American Jews. This is what he thought. This guy was, the editor here of this booklet was a Zionist, and he believed in the unity of the Jewish people. Palestine is the homeland of the Jewish people. But he also believed that in order for the Jews of the Ottoman Empire to get together with the dominant Ashkenazi Jews who are speaking Yiddish, they'd have to learn the dominant Jewish language, which is Yiddish. And he writes that the Ashkenazi Jews have been speaking Yiddish for 1,000 years, and they're going to be speaking it for 1,000 more years. He was off by like 990-something years, basically, with some exceptions. But so what he does here is he introduces the readers to how to say stuff in Ladino and in what he calls Yiddish. Because he actually doesn't know Yiddish, he knows Hochdeutsch, which he writes in Hebrew letters. So his effort at building that bridge is not so successful, but anyhow, it's an attempt. So you can see expressions in Ladino, in Hebrew letters, and then in Yiddish, and then in English characters, and then if you don't know the Latin alphabet, you could sound it out in Rashi script, and that would be your basis of how to get moving and make your way in the American context. Next slide. Okay. Fascinatingly, where does Ladino become activated as a political language? Most of the Jews who come from the Ottoman Empire to the United States are poor. They are going to find jobs in factories in New York City. And Teddy Roosevelt even gave an interview to the New York Times in 1913 saying that the Turkish Jews, this is what he called them, are the most exploited workers in all of the industries of New York City in 1913, because they were completely isolated. They spoke no English, and they spoke no Yiddish, and they had nobody to look after them. This drew many of these folks to revolutionary politics, which is very, very fascinating. So here you can see by the 1920s, the first time that the Ladino language is activated for electoral politics in the United States is by a representative of the Workers' Party, which was the front for the Communist Party in 1924. Very fascinating. And what does he say here? Listen to this. This is the Ladino newspaper. This was the most circulated Ladino newspaper in the history of the world. It was published in New York City from the 1920s to the 1940s, and it was supporting the communist movement in the 1920s. Very, very fascinating. So what does he write? It was quite a scene to see our friend Alberto Mois, who was from Salonika, up on the soapbox, sweating buckets in the middle of the street, speaking about the putrid and deceitful old parties of the Republicans and Democrats, and the need for every Sephardic worker, pushkarchi, which is a neologism, a new word. This suffix G is somebody who does something. So somebody who's pushing a pushcart, a peddler, they're a pushkarchi. Okay, and a shopkeeper, somebody who runs a boutique, like a little shop, they're a boutikaji. Okay, to vote for the Workers' Party. Alberto Mois, who is already known as an orator whose words are as sweet as honey, made everyone's jaws drop, and even the Yiddishim, which was the Ladino word for Yiddish-speaking Ashkenazi Jews. They were Los Yiddishim. Were amazed, since it was for the first time in the history of the Sephardim in America that, in the lead-up to elections, a Sephardi could be seen in the middle of the street speaking in the Judeo-Spanish language. If the words of the speaker are heeded, the Republican Democratic parties will be completely eviscerated, and the poor of this nation will finally be saved. So you see the revolutionary politics here, right? Fascinating. And they even published a revolutionary songbook, like the International in Ladino and a bunch of other songs in Ladino that were sung at the picket line and in marches and demonstrations. So fascinating political life emerged. Next slide. But the language came under attack. It came under attack by its own speakers, who became to internalize the critiques foisted upon it by the outsiders, who saw the mixity of the language as a sign, as critics of Yiddish would also see, a sign of the status of the language as a bastard tongue, as a mixed tongue, as not a legitimate language, not worthy of a modern nation, right? This was the critique foisted by anti-Semites and by Zionists, by the way, who shared a perspective that these diasporic languages were no good, okay? Here is Lavara, that same newspaper, 10 years later in the wake of the Depression, coming out of the Depression. Our language is nothing more than a jargon. This is what Yiddish was also called. An absolutely corrupt dialect and nothing more. A language that is not a language, an idiom with neither father nor mother, and born on the afternoon of Tisha B'Av, which marks the destruction of the temple. This is a day of mourning. This is an illegitimate language. Fascinating the way that times have changed and the repudiation of this very language. Next slide. But there are some defenders as well. Back in Salonika, on the eve of the war, let those who say our language impoverished eat halva, which is, you would say in English, like eat crap, eat garbage. Halva is very cheap. It's cheaper than bread in some societies at the time. Is there a language richer than ours, which borrows from every possible language to tell someone, be quiet? Like, shut up. In how many languages do we tell it to him? Shetika, Hebrew, silence, French, mudera, curto, sopa, molche, Bulgarian, piedrolamos, sus, Turkish. So this was the strength of the language. So is it the weakness and the downfall of the language, the mixity, or is it the power of the language? And this would be, final slide here. We'll go to the final slide. Yeah, skip that one. The debate continued as long as the Ladino press remained in print. But as a new American-born generation emerged, or a new Greek-born generation, a new Turkish-born generation, a new generation born in British Palestine speaking Hebrew, Ladino began increasingly to fall by the wayside. There were few defenders of the language. There was a language that didn't have a state behind it. It didn't have an army behind it. What would its future be? But there were a few, very few defenders. Here's one in Lavara, one of the last issues, in 1948, on the eve of the creation of not only the emergence of a new up-and-coming generation of American-born Sephardim who had done things like served in the American army, went to public school and learned English as their dominant language. It's on the eve of the establishment of this new entity called the Jewish state. It is clear that if we want to preserve the Sephardic youth so that they continue their interest in the destiny of their people and their devotion to the Jewish national and spiritual traditions, we must turn to the original source of Jewish vitality among the Sephardim, the Ladino language. We must make good use of the Ladino to continue the great and noble Sephardic tradition, the customs and rituals of the Sephardim, and above all, cultivate the solidarity among the Sephardim who today find themselves dispersed to the four corners of the world. It will be of great assistance for the preservation and the progress of Sephardic Judaism in the United States. This call largely fell on deaf ears. From about 500,000 Ladino speakers at the turn of the 20th century, about 150 to 200,000 are killed during the Holocaust. Through the processes of forced and voluntary assimilation, the language decreased and decreased and decreased, such that today there is not a family in the entire world in which a child is being spoken to organically in the Ladino language. Thank you.
Bring those house lights up a little bit, please. We have time for questions. I want to remind you, as always, that questions are to be framed as questions and not disquisitions. I'll let you field them.
Questions.
So who wants to be first?
Don't be shy. Yes, please.
Are you teaching Ladino as a spoken language in your program? Or?
Yes. So I have a colleague. I was telling some colleagues earlier. We have a professor at the University of Washington who was hired specifically to teach Ladino language and literature. So University of Washington is one of the few places where we have dedicated faculty who is teaching the language and the literary traditions as well, and manuscript. There are also a few other universities across the country where you can learn Ladino, and also in Israel, a little bit in Spain, in France, there are a few places that can do it. I attempted a very wild experiment, which was, I'm a heritage, not a speaker of Ladino, I'm a heritage listener. But I spent many years reading and studying and speaking to my grandfather in Ladino, and I lived in Salonika for a year. Before my Greek was good, I was speaking to the old folks in Ladino. So when I have two kids, for our older kid, I attempted an experiment where I only spoke to him in Ladino for the first 5 years of his life. It was very difficult, one of the most difficult things that I did, because I spoke more like a journalist from Salonika in the 1920s than I did like a parent, because I didn't have the vocabulary. I had to make up all sort of stuff. And there was also a lot of influence from Spanish. So Ladino, we had to guard. I was like a very strange scenario where I was guarding against English, but I was also guarding against Spanish over here. And so the language that my kids wound up absorbing was sort of, it was Ladino based, but also had influences of other languages. Like my spouse doesn't speak Ladino, she speaks Spanish. So we made up some words that my kids, I think are real Ladino words. But this continues the way in which the language has evolved to a certain extent. So remember I mentioned the G suffix. It's from Turkish. It means somebody who does something. And for whatever reason, my kids picked up the word for the trash collectors come by. That's basura is trash in Spanish. So in our house, we call the trashmen basurajis. This is a word that is invented in my home, and maybe others now use it, but it's a neologism, a new word. Yes?
Is there a systematic effort to preserve Ladino song?
Ladino song is one of the, so the question is there a systematic effort to preserve a Ladino song? And the area of a song is one of the better documented domains, especially those songs that are perceived or do have origins in medieval Spain. Some of the ballads, you have faculty here at the University of Washington who really have a tremendous knowledge about this subject. But there are also many different styles of Ladino songs, because there were also new compositions that emerged in the 19th, 20th centuries that were set to all different genres and all different styles of music. So in the Oriental or Turkish style of music, then there are synagogue liturgy, and so a wide range of different kinds of musical styles. And there is a much better effort over the last number of decades to document those songs. So there are quite a lot of field recordings and also popular performers that have commercially recorded the songs. Really, since the advent of the phonograph, there have been records of Ladino songs that were recorded whether in New York or in Istanbul and other places. So there's a very rich repertoire of Ladino song that you can access still today.
Why is it so specifically associated with Castilian Spanish as opposed to other regional Spanish languages?
Great. Perhaps some of my colleagues could address this better, but my understanding is that Castilian became many of the Jews wound up adopting and embracing Castilian because of its status, and it was a dominant language that they brought with them from the Iberian Peninsula, and it mixed, when they arrived in Istanbul or Salonika, it mixed with elements of Aragonese and Catalan and Valenciano and Portuguese, but the Castilian remained the primary base of the language, and that continued until modern times. Yes?
I've looked and I've never been able to find on YouTube a version of the Internationale in Ladino.
Yes.
I can find it in Yiddish, but I haven't been able to find it in Ladino.
Yes. As of yesterday, you're in luck. There's one now online that I worked with some colleagues to produce. So if you write to me, I can send you the link to that. It's not on YouTube, but it is online, and a group in New York performed it and recorded it, the Internationale in Ladino, based on the manuscript that I showed you earlier, the songbook that was published in New York on the Lower East Side in 1919. Yes?
Could you say a couple more words about the interactions of the Ashkenazim and the Sephardim in that period when the Sephardim were first arriving?
Yeah, so the question is about interactions between Sephardic Jews and Ashkenazi Jews. The first thing that I would say is that we oftentimes think about these cultural spheres as separate. There's the Sephardim, and there's the Ashkenazim, and there's Mizrahim, and maybe some other different categories. There are many different kinds of Jews who spoke in many different kinds of languages. The Ottoman Empire was actually one of those spaces where many of those communities converged. There were Ashkenazi communities in Istanbul, for example, Ashkenazi communities in Jerusalem, as another place. There was, in places that we associate with Ashkenazi Jews, there were historic, important Sephardic communities like Vienna. Vienna had a very important Ladino-speaking Ottoman Jewish community. In the United States, there were tremendous tensions, I would say, that initially met the encounter of the Ladino-speaking and the Yiddish-speaking Jews because, and there are many stories about this in the press and in the memoirs and in oral testimonies, that the Ashkenazi Jews could not recognize the Ladino-speaking Jews as Jewish, primarily because they didn't speak Jewish, because Yiddish is Jewish. How can you be Jewish if you don't speak Jewish? How can you be Jewish if you don't speak Jewish? You've never seen a matzo ball in your life. You look like an Italian, you gesticulate like a Greek, and you dress like a Turk. So this is not Jewish, this is something else. And so there were tremendous tensions initially, such that some of the first, even the Zionist editor of one of the Ladino newspapers went to the Kehillah, which was one of the main Jewish institutions in New York City in the early 20th century, asked for a subvention to support the Ladino newspaper. They said no. There was another episode in which a Sephardic organization tried to apply to be members of the Jewish Federation. Probably, maybe you have a Jewish Federation here. In 1927, the Jewish Federation conducted a study to find out who are these people. We don't know anything about them. And the opening line of the study, which was written by a scholar who was then a graduate student, became a professor and dean later at Columbia University, it begins, I'm paraphrasing, but this is the idea. It says that the Sephardic Jews are as alien to the Ashkenazi Jews as black people are to the white Southerner. I mean, you can't really get, I mean, this is a place in which it's illegal for black people and white people to marry each other, right? And he describes all of the allegedly deleterious characteristics of Sephardic Jews based on their proximity to either blacks or Arabs. The application of the Sephardic organization to the Federation is denied. And that was something that the leaders of the New York Sephardic community continued to lament, and they just didn't get it. They didn't get it through the 80s. I mean, you can see them talking about this one thing that happened in 1927. Things would change, but there were initially quite a lot of tensions. But you could see as these tensions were transpiring and this sense of non-mutual recognition, you could also see in the Ladino newspapers on the everyday basis, there was a fishmonger that was Goldenberg's Pechico. You know, like Goldenberg, I mean, you can infer what this guy is, you know, that he's an Ashkenazi guy advertising in the Ladino newspaper. So it wasn't like they were separated. It wasn't really like blacks and whites, but it sort of was to a certain extent, really until after World War II. Then you would start to see things like intermarriage, and that's the word that they used, between Yiddishim and Sephardim, Ashkenazi Jews and Sephardic Jews, to become more common and less like, you know, we're going to sit Shiva if my son or my daughter marries somebody from a different people, a different nation, a different religion, a different race. Those are some of the more painful episodes in the history of that encounter. Me being such a product of one. You know, my mother is Ashkenazi, my father is Sephardic. My bubby, you know, didn't believe that my father was Jewish. What kind of name is Naar? I mean, you know, and no Yiddish and all this sort of stuff. So that persisted. But the story is different now. Yes?
Well, during the period of living in the Ottoman Empire, before there was the United States, before there were the nation states of Europe, what was the condition of the Sephardic community? Was there active suppression of them as a people? Did they suffer, you know, the Judimi with the, you know, with the hats and the yellow? What was the condition?
It's a great question. So what is the condition of the Jews living in the Ottoman Empire prior to the rise of modern nationalism? So it is very important to recognize, as you alluded to, that non-Muslims living in the Ottoman Empire were essentially second-class subjects. Some people say second-class citizens, but that's really a misnomer because nobody was a citizen. There was no such thing as rights and duties. There were differential privileges. Muslims had more privileges. Jews and Christians had the privilege of living in the Ottoman Empire as long as they pledged loyalty and did not rebel, and they paid taxes, oftentimes exponentially higher than their Muslim neighbors did. But if they were able to do that, they could live in relative peace, they could practice their religion, they could speak their language. And that obtained largely until the 19th century, with some episodes, like when Jewish communities couldn't pay their taxes, they would be repressed with violence. But they were never forced to change their language or their religion or anything else like that. The other thing that's very important to recognize in the Ottoman Empire was that when the state did come down on its subject populations, it was usually the Christians that suffered the most. They were the primary others in the Ottoman Empire. Jews were much closer to the Ottoman state. And they were much closer to their Muslim neighbors. Shared customs like circumcision, for example, the closeness of halal and kashrut. The Christians were on the outside. All the Muslim and Jewish men had beards. Christians didn't necessarily. The Muslim Jews and the Muslim women and the Jewish women, they covered their hair due to sniut, due to modesty. So there were lots of certain kind of closeness there that nonetheless, there was not a world of equal citizenship until really the 19th century. I would add there what's interesting, when do Jews in the Ottoman Empire, on paper at least, become citizens of the Ottoman Empire? 1869. Which in the story of Jewish emancipation is like right in the middle of the story. Jews in Germany are emancipated not until 1871. Jews in Russia, not until 1917. So we may have an association that the Muslim world is, backwards or behind or not as enlightened or something like that. Not necessarily the case in the Ottoman Empire, which was part and parcel of this broader process of transformation of the modern times. Yes?
You mentioned that there were periods from time to time when Jews, in fact, were persecuted for not paying taxes. Didn't the Pasha bring Jews, invite the Jews to the Ottoman Empire to collect?
Yes. So
they knew it, they went both ways.
Correct. So Jews were brought to and moved around the Ottoman Empire because there was a perception that they would be loyal, more loyal than the Christian population. So like when Istanbul, Constantinople was conquered, the Ottoman Sultan brought Jews from Salonika to resettle Constantinople. When the island of Rhodes was conquered by the Ottomans, it was resettled by the Sultan bringing Jews there. So this was a sense that they could help. This is also essentially medieval Spanish practice too, that Jews were seen as useful for the ruling populations. The one thing that I would add though is that in terms of those dynamics that are at play with the Ottoman Empire, sometimes Jews did not pay their taxes in money. Sometimes they paid their taxes in textiles. So like the Jewish community of Salonika, which was the largest community, they apparently brought some technology from the Iberian Peninsula that introduced new ways of generating garments, okay? And this garment production was sought after by the Sultan. And so the Sultan said that the Jews, you don't have to give us all your taxes in money. You manufacture the uniforms for my personal military, which is called the Janissaries. At a certain time in the 17th century, Italian textiles, the quality of those textiles surpassed those that the Jews of Salonika were able to produce. And the Sultan got really upset, and he brought the leader of the Jewish community of Salonika to Istanbul and executed him. But that was really an exception. That was really an exception. It was very unusual. But in other words, it was possible. So in other words, I don't want to give you a sense of a rosy picture of the Ottoman world, but from the perspective of Ottoman Jews themselves, they saw it as less bad, at least, than what Jews were experiencing in other parts of Europe, in Christian Europe. Yes? Maybe last question, maybe? Two more? Okay, great.
Is there an effort to create a repository of Ladino cultural artifacts, books, things like that, the way they did for the Yiddish Book Center? And are you still discovering, or do you hope to discover, treasure troves of material the way they discovered in the bookshelves and the attics of people who were leaving the Bronx and Brooklyn?
Inshallah. I hope that will happen one day. I talked to Aaron Lansky when I began of the Yiddish Book Center, when I began this project in Seattle to try to bring out the artifacts of people's homes. And it was fascinating. When I arrived to Seattle, I was picked up by a member of the community. Not a colleague, but a guy from the community picked me up at the airport because he was so eager to, and he had Ladino books in his car, waiting to show me. He says, what is this? He had Me'am Loez. We went straight from the airport to his house to study Me'am Loez. I'm not kidding, it was really amazing. Over time, we have been able to amass about 10% of the known literary output of the Ladino-speaking Sephardic Jews. So if there are something like 25,000 Yiddish titles that are known, there are about 4,000 Ladino titles that are known. So much smaller, like there were 500,000 Ladino speakers, 13 million Yiddish speakers at the height. So we're talking about completely different numbers in modern times. But just in Seattle, in 10 years, we collected about 10% of the known literature. I hope that in collaboration with other institutions across the country, at the National Library in Israel, we may be able to, it's not an impossible task, right? It's 4,000 texts. That's a discrete, limited, it's a relatively big number because we started with 0, but that's something that we hope to achieve through collaboration. And we've been able to find many other documents, and people send me all sorts of stuff, and I go to their houses and they have things in the most unusual places, under the bed, in the kitchen, in the cupboard. Here's a 19th century, but here's an 18th century thing. Why is it there? Can't believe it's there. So the way that we were able to develop this initiative, because a lot of people saw these literally as their treasures. These were the things that connected them to their forebears, to the old country. Even though 95% of the people didn't know what the things were, or couldn't necessarily read them, even if they understood Ladino, they didn't want to give them up. So that's why the digital option became very important. So we digitized the stuff and we gave them back to those people who wanted it back. Now those people are unfortunately passing away, and now their children are coming to me. What is all this stuff? Why didn't you take this 10 years ago? And I have to explain. One of the first documents that came to my attention was a document that was from 1942, a handwritten document in that Sephardic Hebrew cursive script, which is medieval is called Al-Hamiado. In the modern times, it's called Solitreo. This is that Sephardic script. And the guy had grown up in a Ladino-speaking home. He was 92 years old. This is 2011. Okay? He had grown up in a Ladino-speaking home, but he never learned how to read and write in the old-style script. So I start reading him this document, and he becomes emotional because it's his grandfather's last will and testament. And he says, I've been waiting 70 years for you to come and tell me what my grandfather had to say. And that was the moment that I was like, I got to go and find out what else is out there. And that sort of started the more intentional process of collecting the materials. And so, Aaron Lansky, he said he had one piece of advice for me, which I did not take. Whether I regret it or not, I don't know. You can ask me in some years. He said, don't do it at your university. He said, you got to do it independently because they will do with the bureaucracy and the red tape. And that's why it's been a long process. Maybe he was right, I'm not sure. But I'm hoping that in collaboration with other institutions across the country, like Harvard and the Library of Congress, they call me with questions. We have more stuff than the Library of Congress does. Even the National Library of Israel, when they don't know what they have, they write me an email and say, hey, what is this? And I say, I don't know. Let's look. Yes, in the back.
I'm curious, I have relatives that are originally from Rhodes that live in Seattle.
Oh, great.
For 3 or 4 generations.
What are the family names?
Franco.
It doesn't limit, narrow it down, but yes, I know many Francos, yes.
So I'm wondering what you're doing in terms of, in addition to literature, collecting family stories, family interviews, I think following up on your last comment.
So
documenting, videography.
So we haven't had a systematic oral history project yet or videography project, but with some of my students we have done some dozens of oral histories, and I hope to do more. I hope to do more. We haven't had the, shall we say, the bandwidth or the human power to do that just yet, but I am working with a national organization which is called the Sephardic Brotherhood of America, which is like a Landsmannschaft organization, like a local mutual aid organization that was established by Jews from Salonika, then it opened up to everybody. It's the largest and the longest enduring of those, and with them they are now embarking on a national oral history project. So my hope is with them we'll be able to collect more of those stories. The thing that I didn't do, and I really wish I had, was when I would go, and I had a colleague, we would go to people's homes like Lansky did, and they would give us bizcochos, like Sephardic cookies, and other kinds of treats, and then they'd tell us about, well, this was a book from my nonna or my nono, and we should have recorded that. You know, those were the histories that were happening as they were describing but we were so focused on taking down, okay, the bibliographic information, you know, it just, there was limits. We have maybe one more question or no?
That's your call. You're the
okay.
voice.
Oh, all right. Well, now we have 4 more questions.
What?
You gotta.
Talk about the significance of the White Tower.
Okay, the White Tower. Maybe I'll let me collect the questions and then I'll give you one answer. Do you have a question there?
Really quickly, because the Holocaust, goes down into there, do you have a way of connecting with, are they dealing with the Sephardic stuff at the Shoah Foundation?
So yeah, there are oral histories, testimonies at the Shoah Foundation. There are no permanent exhibition aspects in the Holocaust Museum that deal with Sephardic Jews. And every time a Sephardic Jewish person goes to the Holocaust Museum who has family that was impacted by the Holocaust, they write me a letter and they say, why is there nothing there? And then I write the Holocaust Museum and they say, why is there nothing there? So maybe one day there will. Same thing with Yad Vashem. Yad Vashem does not have very good representation of the Ladino-speaking communities either. I don't know what you, all right, yeah.
The White Tower.
Oh, the White Tower. Well, go ahead and then I'll tell you about the White Tower, yeah.
Well, you mentioned something about cookies, and I'm thinking about recipes and recipes. And I wonder what we know about cooking that is specifically from.
That is one of the domains. I think food is the last thing to go. The food stays. So some of my students whose great-grandparents came from Rhodes, for example, they know about the foods. They may not know about anything else, but they know about the foods and they like them. They tend to like them. So there is a vast cookbook literature, you could say, so you can find, and the variations too. In Rhodes they did it like this and they called it that. And in Salonika they did it like this and they called it something else. And in Monastir they didn't do that at all. And in Istanbul they did something else, right? So there are all of these variations that you can find. And so there are some really great cookbooks too. Feel free to write me. I could give you some recommendations if you're interested. To the gentleman's question in the back about the White Tower. The White Tower is sort of the symbol of Salonika. And the White Tower, when I first went to Salonika, I asked my nono, who was born there, that was his only question for me. Is the White Tower still there? Because his understanding, his community had been decimated by the Holocaust, he had already left. This was a place in which there were 250 rabbis, 60 synagogues, 12 Jewish schools, 2 yeshivot. I mean, it was a real Jewish metropolis. All of that was destroyed. The Jewish cemetery was the size of 80 football fields and had 350,000 graves dating back to 1492, in some instances to the era of Apostle Paul. So all of that was destroyed during the Second World War, and some of it even before. And so his question was, one of his memories that he used to tell me about was he used to go by the sea where the White Tower stood. The White Tower, there's a big debate over what is the origins of this big monument on the sea. It was built either by the Venetians or by the Ottomans, but it served for many years as a prison. It was a prison, and then it was later whitewashed in the 19th century and became more of an Ottoman government building, and that's why it's called the White Tower, because it was whitewashed, according to legend, by Jews at the behest of the Ottoman Sultan. And it remains sort of a symbol of the city today.
Thank you so much. So clearly we could go more, but we're not going to. But if you would like to learn more from Dr. Naar, please join us tomorrow at noon to hear him speak about New York's Sephardic cafes, communal, musical, culinary, and political hubs in the early 20th century. You can find more details on our website online, and as always, lunch will be served. Our next and final community lecture will be on Wednesday, April 15th again here at the Davies JCC Center. Come learn from Hannah Poland-Galay, Director of the Institute for Holocaust, Genocide, and Memory Studies, and Professor of Jewish Studies and History at the University of Massachusetts, Amherst. She will be presenting her lecture, What Did People Talk About in the Warsaw Ghetto? Yiddish Words of the Holocaust. Thanks for coming. See you next time.